So hello and welcome to this special edition of the Kscope Social Media Lounge interviews. I have with me here a very mysterious guest. He is used to interviewing many other experts in the industry, but not too many people interview him. So I'm lucky, lucky person here at Kscope to be interviewing none other than Rittman.
Thank you. You'll find out soon why nobody interviews me in this session. But nice to meet you, and it'd be good to answer questions.
Nice to meet you too. So I know that last year you attend Kscope. How are you enjoying it this year?
Yeah, it's good. Good to be back. I've been to most Kscopes. I think the first one I went to was in Washington, maybe some years ago. And it's a bit of a shame to miss the World Cup this year because we usually have World Cup on wins in the Kscopes. There's usually a point there where England loses to Germany. So it's quite lucky to not have any nations.
So how about this year? What sessions are you presenting this year?
So I'm presenting just one session this year on Untitled Cloud data acquisition. So it's talking about what it does and specifically it's working around data engineering features. So that's my session later on.
Okay, and then you're also doing something special to this case.
Yeah, we're doing a live edition of the podcast that I host. So we're doing a live edition of Drill to Detail on Thursday. So doing a session on history of Oracle BI. We're doing it in the big data and data warehousing track. So I might have to change the agenda around a little bit. But yeah, we're doing that, and I'm being joined by Stuart Bryson.
All right, so that's why we're here today. That's why I'm interviewing Mark today to talk about his podcast, Drill to Detail. I was introduced to it a couple of months ago, and I can say it's a great podcast to learn about, the Oracle technologies or other technologies in the area of the big data and analytics. Okay, so what inspired you to create the podcast?
Well, it was because I used to have a blog, and I moved on from my old company, and I thought it'd be interesting to do something a bit different to doing writing. So there's a few podcasts I used to listen to, maybe more from the Oracle, actually from the Apple world, and from technology in general. Things like the daily, things like the talk show, and accidental tech podcasts. And so I thought it'd be interesting to try and do some of those things, but within the Oracle and within the technology world. And it was also a good opportunity to sort of reach out to some people and look at some technologies other than Oracle as well. So yeah, it's been going now for about 2 years, 57 episodes, and yeah, it's interesting.
All right, so did you, the current role that you have is at Qubit?
Yep.
In your episode 16, 26 I believe?
Yeah, one of those anyway.
Right, one of those. I think you interviewed one of the product managers for Qubit. Yeah. And was it about that time when you moved to Qubit, or was it?
Well, no, I'd actually joined Qubit. I was actually interviewed by him, and it was an interesting experience being interviewed by someone who's half your age and was cleverer than you. But he was a guy called Alex Olivier, and he had built out this data pipeline using Google Cloud, and really was doing real big data work on real big data architectures and technology at scale. And it was interesting. I mean, I think it was interesting to see the difference between doing consulting work and seeing this actually in real life. And it's also interesting to maybe look at new ways of doing things. It was a very interesting introduction to things like elastic architectures and working with kind of serverless technology. Yeah, it was an interesting interview, really.
All right, so from that episode, which was episode 16, and now you have episode 56, working at Qubit, which, by the way, doesn't have anything to do with quantum mechanics.
Well, it doesn't. We're not quantum scientists there, but I think it was the name came from the quantum equivalent of a binary bit. Okay. What it has to do with marketing, I don't know, but I think it's certainly. Maybe one of the things they were talking about was the very granular data they connect and the transformative effect of that on marketing.
Okay, so during that range of time from episode 16 until 56 right now on the latest, how has the startup network like Qubit and other products that you have interviewed, how has that influenced the speaker selection for your podcast?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, certainly, it's. I think one thing to be aware of is it's not to say that startups and new products and so on are necessarily better than Oracle, but they serve a different market. So when somebody buys Oracle technology, they don't particularly buy it, I don't think, for the features or for the fact it's cutting edge technology. They buy it because it integrates with everything else, and they can kind of I suppose their company can transact with a company of the scale of Oracle. But what's been interesting with the startups is, they start from a different point of view. A lot of the work is to do with a lot of the audiences and users are in the marketing space and the kind of, I suppose, fintech space and so on. And it's different types of users, different types of technology, different, I suppose, outlooks on things. And certainly I'd like to maintain that kind of connection and that interest in that market if I ever move back into consulting again.
Right.
Yeah.
So Kscope18 is a marketing company.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in one of your tweets, I believe, that especially for GDPR, that's going to change the, to kind of change the ad tag bubble. Now, do you have any plans on creating a podcast just to talk about GDPR?
Well, we've had a couple of episodes that have talked about GDPR. So we had a guy from one of the kind of BI surveys that goes on. And he was talking about how, particularly in Europe, particularly the German-speaking countries, GDPR is a really big deal. And I think that I think it's a good thing in that I think that it makes people aware of the data and the value of it they've got. I think that I think a lot of companies are waiting to see what happens in terms of kind of like legal precedent to find out what we can do and what we can't do. There's a lot of kind of assumed or certainly very kind of broad interpretations of what consent is and so on. But I think anything really that allows people to control their data and have more choice over what happens with it, and therefore when people do market to them, it's done with consent and informed kind of involvement in that process, then I think it's good really. And I think anything that gets away from just this blanket spamming of people and the feeling people have got that their data is being exploited and abused is good really. Yeah.
Okay. So apart from the privacy, feature or part, I guess the GDPR will also boost the demand for big data and especially analytics.
Well, I think it's not necessarily going to boost it. It's certainly going to keep the emphasis on it, and I think certainly it's going to have some changes in the way that products are built and the way that kind of big data and machine learning is used. The way that you now have to really have to show how a decision is made. So it has an effect on things like neural network technologies, where you've got this kind of self-learning and adapting process that will potentially make a decision, but not necessarily be able to kind of go back at this moment to be able to say, well, how is that made? So certainly there are vendors out there like DataRobot, for example, that have built in straight away from their products this idea that you can trace how a decision is made and the way that you can, I suppose, be accountable for the decisions you've made and the outcomes of those really. It's interesting to think, I think it'll have less, personally I think it'll have less of an effect on things like kind of financial roll-ups and consolidations and all that. But I think certainly from the marketing side, anything where somebody's data, particularly where that data is being captured not necessarily with their full understanding. So where you're paying for services by donating your data, and where that data is used for things where, for example, if you imagine you're a sort of a travel agency or kind of like an airline firm, what you don't sometimes realise is that even the things you do prior to filling in a form or submitting your details, just those kind of choices you make over what categories you look at, your category preference and that sort of thing, that can all be used as well to kind of maybe to personalise what you're doing and to influence products and services that you're offered.
And especially like for the mobile applications in the EPM space, where the users don't just use data out of their EPM applications, they can use those same visualization tools to do analytics on the data that they have on their phones. I guess that may play a role.
I guess so. I guess it's where the data that's being analysed and used is not necessarily. I mean, I think in a finance application where you've got someone on their phone, they're looking at the kind of like the roll-up of it, I mean, their data may be used to kind of like to maybe influence what chart is shown and what data is shown because they're maybe near a customer or something. But it's more where that data is being used to generate sort of value out of it that isn't necessarily kind of understood by that person. So you might go in there, it might be a sales kind of like chart on your phone. You're going there as using Essbase on there. But it's more about the data that's been used to provide the service that might have then resulted in that kind of revenue being earned and so on. And really, I see it's more about people's own data being used for things that they didn't expect it was being used for, particularly to monetize it.
All right. So speaking of personal data and EPM applications, Have you tried to visualize your Strava data using Synopsis, the mobile application?
Well, I've used Synopsis. Synopsis, for anyone who's not seen it, is a kind of like an iPhone app or a mobile app that Oracle provide that lets you take, say, CSV data and then visualize it in charts and graphs and so on. So I haven't used the Strava data. What I have done is I've used apps on my iPhone to take the Apple Health data I've got and then export that as CSV and then load that into Synopsis. And that worked quite nicely. And you can go in there, you can look at your sleep patterns, you can look at maybe your weight changes over time. So that's quite a nice little product.
All right, so we were talking about your Strava data and how you are using it to visualize it in Oracle DB, the OAC Data Lake edition, and also the Synopsis app. Now going back from working out to music, because I know you like to post and share remixes.
Yeah. So actually I do have a life outside of kind of Oracle really, and one of the things I like doing actually is I used to DJ back in the, probably shows my age here. So I used to DJ back in the it was the 90s actually. So when in Britain we used to have acid house came out and house music. So I used to DJ at all the kind of big acid house nights and stuff in Brighton and so on. And I kept that going over the years, and people say now that, in the old days, people, when they got to sort of like late 40s, 50s, they used to play golf and buy sports cars. But now in Britain, they all buy expensive bikes and they DJing in their bedrooms. And so I still do a lot of DJing. I post on Mixcloud and I post on SoundCloud. And I enjoy it, house music and that sort of thing. Yeah.
All right, and you're using your mixes as well to start your episodes, and I've noticed.
Well, that wasn't.
A pretty consistent start to your episodes until the one where it was about the OLAP wars. Cameron Lacapore.
Yeah. So I think it's nice sometimes to change things around, and I switched to music at some point in there. The point really, I suppose, I'm trying to make it sound sort of reasonably professional, but also I think it's important to change things around a little bit, and it'd be nice somehow to to maybe combine them a little bit. But certainly for now, the podcast is going well. It's sometimes interesting posting on Twitter. 1 minute you're posting about some kind of complex technical thing, and then you post some sort of like hour-long banging mix on Mixcloud. I think I quite enjoy the fact that it's probably a little bit kind of like incongruous sometimes how you can be into those different things really. But I suppose that's life. It's nice to have different interests in life.
That's right. All right, so let's get into some more detailed questions about the podcast. First is, how do you pick your speakers?
How do I pick my speakers? Well, I pick people. Well, I look at what's topical. So I look at, I suppose, what is an interesting topic in the industry at the moment, and who would be someone I'd be genuinely interested to kind of speak to, and would perhaps be an opportunity to approach them with a kind of reason to it. You can't just ring someone up and just say, can I speak to you for an hour about this thing? Because it would be a bit odd. I also try and find people who've got a little bit of personality as well. So there's often a kind of balance between someone who, sometimes the people who are the best speakers often work in sales or marketing, and quite often they're not necessarily the best people to have on the podcast because they just kind of give you a very kind of like bland line about their product and so on. But equally, you can get people on sometimes who just aren't very good at conversation, and you want a little bit of balance really. But where I think some of the best episodes that I've had are from people who aren't necessarily the most kind of slick in terms of how they talk, but they've got an interesting story to tell. So people like Cameron was great. Cameron was a great episode about his life as an S-based consultant, but also people like Julian Hyde, who is someone who he's now at Looker, but he was a thinker behind a lot of the features we now take for granted in data warehousing, things like kind of summary management. He was a person behind Mondrian, the kind of OLAP server. He was a very, it was one of those conversations that was a little, I wouldn't say awkward at the start, because I think like a lot of us, you were a little bit kind of like wary about speaking, I'll go now. But he was a good one. So I tend to pick people who've got something interesting to say, who I'd be interested to talk to, and would and will be able to go, and this is where the kind of name of the podcast comes in, who will be able to go into detail of what they're talking about. So it's that, and again, this is where with the podcast format of an hour, it's long enough that we can actually kind of talk about the things we're trying to get into, not just kind of like have one question then move on. The other thing is, it's about what would I want to listen to as well, really.
Yeah.
So.
And how long does it take to coordinate with your speakers?
Takes a little bit of time actually. I mean, so the format, the way it works is that I'll tend to approach somebody, and what I'll do is I tend to aim higher each time, really, you know, and so I'll typically use the fact that somebody else who was slightly less famous than them was stupid enough to agree to come on the podcast, and I'll kind of say, oh, this person came on as well, and they'll be flattered and they'll come on. But then what I'll do is I think again it's important to have a bit of a kind of point to the conversation, really, where we've kind of not necessarily planned out to the final degree everything we're going to say, but we know what the arc of the conversation is going to be, and we know the person who's speaking is confident that this thing they wanted to talk about will get to that at some point. But I don't want it to be just a kind of like a marketing thing. So, and I do throw the occasional kind of question in there that is getting to the point of this, really. So, for example, I've got someone coming on who's the next recording, who it's an interesting one where there is some slight controversy around the person, and I don't want to kind of like I don't want to go lead on that straight away, but I think there's an interesting few questions to ask there, really, and it's trying to put it. I think it's that British thing of trying to ask somebody the right questions, but in a polite and kind of constructive way. Yeah. So
when you come up with questions, I guess you create a list of questions, and then based on the conversation.
Yeah, I tend to more plan out the arc of the conversation. So I'd say, right, my typical kind of like guide is I'll say, let's try and pick 3 topics that are related, that are topical at the moment, and that are going to be of interest to the audience. And I'll tend to bullet point the things that I think it'd be good to talk about, but only at a bullet point level. So I'll say things like, so when I had Kent Graziano on, for example, you know, I talked about, I said, well, look, you know, surely data modeling is dead now. Surely with kind of flexible schema. Now, obviously, there's a slight kind of, what's the word? I'm saying it to be controversial in some respects, but you know, we get into that. We get into the Snowflake side, and I tend to know a lot of these people quite well from history, so I know about his background, for example. So yeah, I'll bullet point things, but we won't slavishly follow it, but we will try and keep to that structure.
Okay. And then from all the sessions that you've held with various, product managers or technical experts, what product do you think influenced you more into going and into like researching it more, even later after the podcast?
Interesting. I think that they're all interesting in lots of respects. I think one of the most impactful conversations I had was actually with someone who used to work for Oracle but now works for Google, Dan McClary. So Dan McClary was the PM for Big Data SQL, and then he went to Google and he's now one of the PMs for BigQuery. And some of the conversations I had with him around where Google are going with this, and where some of the kind of the differences in how BigQuery works compared to, say, in those days, things like Oracle, that had a big influence on the next 2 years, really, where I kind of worked and what I did. So yeah, some of them are really, really, really interesting, really, and some are more just kind of fun, you know. So yeah,
right, yeah. So let me ask about the location. Where do you actually, record it?
Well, I tend to record it in my house. So sometimes I'll record things when I'm out on the road, and I might try and grab a room in the office at work. But in general, I'll try and record it at home because then the sound quality is a bit better, really, and that sort of thing. But yeah, at home, and I just edit it then from there.
And how long does it usually take to edit them?
Well, editing takes typically about an hour, 2 hours, because I have to edit out all the ums and ers and background noise and interruptions.
Oh, so you also edit those things?
Oh yeah, so I tend to, what I like to do is, during a conversation with somebody, you'll often go, and yeah, and whatever. Yeah. And that sort of like is good, so the person you're speaking to gets the feedback that you're hearing them, but the audience don't want to hear that. So what I do is I record it with 2 channels, and then as one person speaking, I'll mute the other side. So, and also if we end up speaking over somebody, which is usually me speaking over somebody, I'll then edit it so that I then pull that back, so that then they don't get interrupted by me. My bit then comes in afterwards. And so generally, what it's all about is editing out me interrupting people, and me just kind of making loads of noise in the background while they're trying to speak.
Okay,
so when you hear it sounds very professional. But at the time, it's more noisy and more things going on.
So I don't know if we're definitely gonna edit this interview, but maybe we should try it. What application do you use to do that?
Just use Camtasia. So just this thing on the Mac called Camtasia. Sometimes I use Audacity to level out the sound, but generally it's just an app on the laptop and just edit it there visually and so on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what has been your favorite episode out of all the 56?
Oh, it's got to be the 50th episode. So for the 50th episode, we did a special where Stuart Bryson, who came on the first time, came on as a guest again, but what we did is a good sport here. We had a third, for the first time ever, a third guest that I didn't tell Stuart who it was going to be, but then Stuart had to then interview this person without knowing who it's going to be, and so on. And so we got through the episode halfway through, and then I patched in this third person, and it was Kscope18, who most people will kind of know here as from Pythian and so on. And then Stuart had to interview him without any kind of preparation, which was really good, and it was good fun. And that was my favourite episode, really, and actually the one that had the greatest listening figures in the end.
Okay, is that the episode when you kind of were talking about the agile methodology as well?
Yeah. I called him the Karl Marx of agile methodologies, because agile is always one of those things where if it didn't work in a project, it's because you weren't agile enough. And it's a bit like communism, in that communism doesn't work because it's not communist enough, and then everyone dies at the end, and it's horrific. So it's kind of I called him the Karl Marx of that. But he actually got the Innovation Award here as well, which is actually that's now his Communist Manifesto, as I put it.
So that's interesting, because I'm giving a session today on agile project.
Well, there you go. With the accent as well, that'd be good. So
so I did hear the episode twice.
Yeah.
All right, and how about the longest episode? I know Cameron's episode has
Well, it's always S-based people that speak the longest, really. And it's always S-based people talking about consultancy. And in fact, actually, where I think the common link in that is what I think is a good topic to talk about, and one that I think is interesting, is the kind of business of consulting. So although we can talk about the technology, I think how you survive as a consultant and how you make a consultancy kind of grow and kind of work, especially as I've been out of that game for the last 2 years. It's kind of interesting to understand, well, how do you still stay relevant 2 years later, 4 years later? How do you retain your staff? How do you kind of like make a success of it when so many projects for customers fail, so many things that technology promises don't work, but you still need to make a success of it? And I think those kind of things, especially with the transition to the cloud as well, interesting topic I think as well.
That's really true. Okay, so the most uncomfortable place you've ever held a podcast?
Well, I've done it. Where was it? I've done a few where it's. I think there was a couple, typically in hotel rooms, where either battery runs out on something or the noise is too much outside. There's one podcast, I won't reveal kind of like who it was with, where I had to go and re-record all of my questions again because the noise was so bad in the background. So I had to go and paste in the actual kind of questions again myself. But generally it's in the office or at home.
And how about one episode where you kind of disagreed with the person you invited in the podcast?
Who's that?
I'm asking you a question.
I don't know. Well, there's quite a few actually. I mean, I tend not to try and sort of. The point of the podcast is not to be the cleverest person in the podcast. So I'm not trying to make the person look silly or whatever. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of times when, I mean, in general, I get people on who I generally agree with because those by definition they're the ones I'd invite on. But But yeah, I think it's something where it's against a British thing. You want to politely disagree with somebody, but generally I'm not there to make the person look stupid or catch them out. I'm there to get them to kind of like, I suppose in a way, dig their own grave sometimes is one way of putting it. That they can let them talk about things and they can then make their case themselves.
Okay, and how about the most uncomfortable session?
Uncomfortable. Not really many uncomfortable. I think that. A couple have been quite difficult to get a conversation out of the person, right. And they're typically the ones where it's quite short. So I think when you look at the ones, that are 30 minutes,
yes.
they're the ones where it's been the hardest to get a conversation out of somebody.
Right, we get a hint.
But yeah.
Okay, so last couple of questions for you.
Okay.
So, what motivates you? That's the question you asked Matt York in the last.
What motivates me? I just like learning things. Really, I like learning things, and I suppose I like doing this. It's interesting. I suppose it's an interesting industry to be in, really. So I think the day it's not interesting is the day I do something else.
Okay. So when you asked the question to Matt, he said, well, first of all, coffee motivates you.
Yeah.
Now, since you're British, tea motivates you.
Well, tea possibly, yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit more about what happened with your tea kettle?
Well, I tried to keep that sort of quiet now, really, but I was famous for 5 minutes back in 2 or 3 years ago when I wired my house up completely to the internet and my kettle went crazy. But I try to keep that quiet now, actually, so that's kind of like in the past for me now. But yeah.
And what happened exactly with the Wi-Fi kettle?
Well, yeah, I tried to connect it to, back in the days when nothing would connect to things like Alexa by itself, I managed to connect it to that and get it to kind of respond to voice controls. But yeah, so that was it. It's all on the internet, yeah.
So a fun question now.
Yeah.
Since you tried to connect the kettle to Wi-Fi, we all know about the Victorian tradition of tea leaf reading in Britain.
Yeah.
Are you going to try to do some sort of machine learning predictions?
Yeah.
Your kettle?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, certainly the kettle now has got its own agent and has nothing to do with me anymore. But potentially, yeah.
Okay, we'll wait for it.
Thanks.
And then one last question for you.
Yeah.
Have you thought about being involved into non-profit organizations by using the visualizations?
Well, I did some work, again, after I left my old company and I was on sabbatical. I did some work for a local school where I helped them get Raspberry Pis in and did work there. Not so much, and also one thing we did do some work with the Donors Choose data set. So if you go to the Oracle Analytics YouTube site, there is stuff on there we did as well around Donors Choose.
That's a great thing to know.
Okay.
And I have something for you, Mark.
Help.
I have something for you, Mark.
That, yeah.
So you have, you like to remix, and I like photography, and also my husband and I, we have a farm.
Yeah.
A 40-acre farm.
Okay.
Where we're holding cattle.
Okay.
So Mark likes to Wi-Fi his cattle.
Yeah.
And my cattle love to Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Here you go.
Thank you.
Thank you for the interview.
That's great. Thank you.